carpenter back then, you were supposed to grow up and become a carpenter. If you were the son of a miller, you were supposed to grow up and become a miller. But thank goodness Rembrandt had older brothers to take over the milling business. He could become an artist. And his parents supported him. You know, since they didn't need him to run the business, they supported him when he said he wanted to become an artist. Now, during Rembrandt's time, you didn't go to art school, art class, art university like many people do today. Back then, you would become an apprentice in the studio of a master artist, which is what he did when he was a teenager in the town, in his hometown of Leyden. And once he graduated as a full artist, after a few years as an apprentice, then he made the move to Amsterdam. Amsterdam was the most important city in Holland 400 years ago. It still is the most important city in Holland. This is a drawing he did of Amsterdam. You can see a lot of the windmills in the background. It's changed a lot since then. It's grown up quite a bit since then. Look at this self-portrait of him. Look at how fancy his clothing is. We're going to see a little bit more of that. You know, these self-portraits reveal a lot about Rembrandt. He never wrote a biography of his life. He never really wrote about himself. He didn't leave us a diary. But we can tell a lot in his almost 70 self-portraits that he did. We can tell a lot. His self-portraits give us a lot of clues as to what his life was like. And when you look at this, sorry, I'll get back to that in a second. When you look at this self-portrait as a young man moving to Amsterdam, you can tell this is a person who really liked nice clothing. This would have all been very expensive with the gold braid and the feather and the fancy fabric. We're going to see a little bit more of that. He gets to Amsterdam and he starts getting jobs painting. And he became very popular pretty fast as a portrait painter. This is a good example of how he painted. Here we see a man who was a businessman. You know, they didn't have computers or telephones in those days, of course, so his business records are right here in the book. He's looking very important with his, you know, his business right there. And look at the highlight and shadow for contrast. He wanted you to notice this. He wanted you to notice the face and notice that collar. We're going to talk about that. So he paints that in highlight colors. And next to it is all the shadow colors, the dark colors. They're important because they make you notice the highlight areas even more. I have often seen Rembrandt art in museums, and I'm always amazed when I stand in front of one of his portraits, because I'm always looking around for the spotlight on the painting. Like, okay, there's got to be a spotlight here and a spotlight here shining on this part of the painting, or down here. But I look and there is no spotlight. It's just the amazing way that Rembrandt painted, which is why if you ask most art experts today, people who, you know, write about art, and you ask them to list the top 10 artists who ever lived, Rembrandt would probably be on most people's lists because he was such a master when it came to painting. He really knew, you know, the right way to paint. We call this Rembrandt lighting. The art world has a very fancy Italian word for it that I won't even try to pronounce. It means light and shadow, but it's too hard for us to remember, so we just call it Rembrandt lighting. This was a time, oh, I forgot to talk about the collar. How can I forget that? How would you like to spend the whole day wearing a collar like that? It would be very, very uncomfortable as far as I'm concerned. And yet, that was a sign of wealth, a sign of success, if you were able to buy and wear a collar like that. My, how fashions have changed. Both men and women wore these collars. And it didn't, you know, if you were a working class person, you couldn't afford a collar like that. That was all ruffled lace and would have been very expensive. They were not sewn to your clothes, they were separate. It was like putting on a necklace. And not only was it a sign of wealth, and that's why this man posed with that fancy collar, because he wanted to let you know he was a successful businessman, But it was also very practical. It was like a bib when you were eating. They didn't have all of the utensils we have today. I don't believe they had a spoon yet. Spoons had not been developed. So imagine trying to have soup. You would pick up the bowl and drink it this way, but oftentimes soup would spill down your chin and onto your clothing. If you were wearing one of those very exaggerated collars, the collar would catch the food and it would keep your clothes clean, which was a good thing because back then people didn't wash their clothes as often as we do today. Sometimes you would wear the same outfit for weeks or months before it ever got washed. So if you could just take your collar off and wash that, and then it kept your clothes a little bit cleaner for the time you were wearing it. Okay, this is not by Rembrandt, but it's a good idea of what life is like. This is the golden age of Holland. This was a time when Holland was a very rich country, a very good economy, a lot of wealthy people. And why? Because they were merchants. They were sending ships like this all over the world, and they were coming back with amazing things from faraway lands. And of course, they would be sold, and then whoever owned these ships became very wealthy. Well, one of their best customers was Rembrandt. As soon as these ships came in, he would be down there at the docks looking at what they brought from a faraway place, and he would be buying them. If you go to Holland today, go to Amsterdam, you can go visit his house, and in one of the rooms, they turned it into like a little museum showing you the kind of things he collected. He collected art from faraway places, antiques. He collected armor. He collected exotic things like seashells, things that you would not find in Holland that didn't exist back then. It had to come from a faraway land. He collected jewelry from his wife, and he collected very fancy clothes from fabrics from faraway places. Let me show you what I mean. Like this. The feather, the turban, the velvet, the brocades, those were coming from, places far away by ship, and he bought them as fast as he could. I taught Rembrandt earlier this year, and a student there said something amazing. I wrote it down because I thought, that is so true, what she said about him. She said, Rembrandt was very smart about art, but he was not very wise about money. And boy, did she nail it on the head, because that's exactly the way he was. He was a great artist, but when it comes to saving money, putting money away for a rainy day, as the saying goes, he never did that. He spent his money as quickly as he made it, buying all of these things for his home, furniture, books, which were very expensive back then, musical instruments, the best foods available at the time. He was spending his money as quickly as he made it, which is okay if you're making good money. There's nothing wrong with spending it if you got it. But you also have to think about the future. Sometimes you may not make as much money, and sometimes you need that savings to live on. But he never saved, and he ran into problems later on, as you're going to find out. So this was very typical of how he would dress. He had a closet full of these exotic costumes, and in this portrait, it looks like a man, a king or a prince from a faraway land, from some exotic place, but it wasn't. It was one of his Dutch friends who he had come and pose for him, wearing some of Rembrandt's costume collection, the turban and the fancy jewelry and the beautiful fabrics. And when you see a close-up of the man's face over here, you look at that and you think, oh my gosh, I think I'm looking at a photograph. It is so full of realistic details. But you're not looking at a photograph. You are looking at a painting done by the great master artist Rembrandt.